Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 1 of All In. You are listening to All In, Living the Mission of God. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Well, we're coming to you today from Chelyabinsk, Russia, and I've got here with me my good friend Ralph Moore, and I'm just going to pick his brain. Ralph has been a real influence in my life over the years. I was sharing with him yesterday while we were having some time together that he mentored me from a distance years ago, probably 15 years ago, Ralph. You put out a series of tapes on many churches, and I devoured those. I wore the tapes out. I listened to them so much, and I used them to train our small group leaders, and so much about what I've learned about discipleship, I learned from you. And so, back then when I was just pastoring this little church out in the middle of nowhere, and I never thought the day would come that I'd actually be able to be working with you like we've been able to do. And and here we are in Russia, and we've been together in France before. We've been together in Ukraine a couple of times, and Hungary, and then Greece as well. And so it's just a great joy to be able to be with you. And so it's a great joy to be with you.
Oh, thank you. I'm enjoying it.
And well, tell me, Ralph. You're famous for being a church planter. I think the last number I saw was like over 1,200 churches. Have been planted because of your ministry. And a lot of people know you on the public side. They know the stories, and they've heard you speak publicly and stuff. And part of what I want to do is to help give people a look behind the curtain and know you, the man, rather than you, the worker, you, the person out there, and the public figure. Because I find that that's so helpful for people to know the inner workings, because it helps them. Sometimes it just gives them permission to be themselves. So that's what we'd like to focus on. Would you mind just tell me a little bit about your story, and tell the people listening to us today, tell us your story and what people should know about Ralph Moore.
Grew up as a kid fighting against a call from God in my life. Ever since I was about 6 years old, I had an experience where I felt that the Lord, I won't go into the details, but he clued me in that he wanted me to be a pastor, and I reacted against it, and so I kind of grew up as the kind of kid that would accept the Lord every Sunday in church, and by Monday lunchtime I was telling dirty jokes. I'd go to school and hear the story, and I'm not going to laugh at it because I got saved last night. And then by pretty soon I was laughing, and next thing you know I'm telling it. Sure, I've lost my salvation, and kind of Mr. Wishy-Washy Christian a whole bunch of my life. Loved the Lord, but didn't know how to live it. And when I was about 18 years old, I met a guy named Roy Hicks Jr., and he was a year older than me. And it's the first guy I knew of my own generation that I actually thought, I could follow this guy anywhere. And this guy actually lives his faith. And just meeting him, actually, it was a profound experience. I'm not sure if I'd say it was a profound spiritual experience. It became that. It was just, I'm just looking at integrity. This guy walks his talk, and I decided I'm going to do that too. And I even in my worst state, even when I tried to be the worst cusser in school because I was the littlest kid and the last one chosen for sports, and I made my mark by my filthy mouth, I'd still try to tell people about Jesus. But I was a pretty mixed up kid. And I saw Roy, and it's like, well, this guy's real. And so I decided I'm going to be real. And so that kind of set me on a little different path. I agreed with the Lord that I would become a pastor, and I thought that meant I'd be in some little church in Eastern Oregon, probably pumping gas for earn a living and be bivocational, and I was up for that. And went to Bible college, did the whole thing, came out real straight arrow. I mean, this was a time when we weren't allowed to wear Levi's to school, and it was real uptight. And all of a sudden, I found myself pastoring a bunch of hippies and bikers, and having to really, really rethink everything. What goes on with the gospel, what goes on with the Bible. I'm trying to teach it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, And all of a sudden I'm starting to doubt my own understanding of the Bible, because when I read the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and really studied it, it didn't fit with what I'd been taught in Pentecostal traditional theology. And so I had to kind of figure all that out, and then culturally adapt to that. I was a straight arrow kid with a bunch of hippies in my church. And so, you know, I just began a journey that kind of set me on a little different road than a lot of other people. And then I ran into a book we were talking about earlier today. A guy named Jim Montgomery wrote a book called New Testament Fire in the Philippines. I think it's been retitled just Fire in the Philippines. In fact, anybody that's interested can Google it, and you can download it free online. Jim's dead now, but they've created a foundation, and that book is out there. And it was about a Foursquare guy, our denomination in the Philippines. They were having 55,000 converts a year, and it was all happening because of rapid multiplication of churches with guys that were lay trained. They were discipled in a local church. And at the end of Montgomery's first edition of the book, since it's been kind of laundered out, but he speculated, and he said he hoped that his writing the book wouldn't destroy what Foursquare was doing in the Philippines, that they wouldn't send a bunch of white guys down there to make it better. And they did. And it ground it all to a halt. But when the glory days were happening, there were like 2 missionary families in the whole country. And if you know the Philippines, there's 300 and some islands.
Right.
And they were ripping. And the whole thing was the Holy Spirit got to have his way. And so as we got started, we began to plant churches. We developed some real kind of personal attitudes, kind of a little bit hippie thing, you know, we're going to be organic and all that. But it was also, we're not going to have any kind of an organization. We're not going to have reporting. You know, I kind of flinch when you mention 1,200 churches, because actually we think it's quite a bit more. I won't even put a number on it. I have a number in my head, but it's all anecdotal. You know, we know about this guy in Latin America that started 350 churches after catching the bug when he was a young boy in our church, and we were just planting churches. So I can't really take credit for that.
Right.
But it came out of a culture that said we're going to just do this thing because it is the Great Commission. And we're not going to own it, and we're not going to put our label on it. You know, we have 106 churches in Pakistan that we've basically funded, and they're called Grace Bible churches. And then the leader over there fell into sex sin and wouldn't submit to discipline, and the whole thing has probably fragmented into 6 different movements. I don't know any of the leaders and don't care to. I figure that it's the Lord's church, and you know, so those are the kind of things that have influenced me to be the kind of person that I am.
Well, there are a lot there that you mentioned that would love to unpack with you, but how did you go about discipling the people? And you know, did you learn things in the early days that you've consistently done over and over again? Because obviously it's reproducible.
Yeah.
What would, if you could encapsulate that for me, what would that look like?
Well, to me, it needs to be scalable and reproducible. By scalable, I mean as the church grows, the system grows with it. And reproducible means that if a guy starts a church and there's 15 people there, he can pull together 2 guys and do it with them. And so all we really do at the core of the thing is meet together in homes in the middle of the week, and we ask this one question, actually a couple questions. But the first question is, give me 2 words that come from your understanding of the sermon last week. Just 2. And usually you get 5 or 6 or 10, but we just get it out of the file cabinet, you know, up into RAM memory so people are thinking about it. And then we go around the room and we just ask everybody, and I usually, if I'm leading it, we always have the leader start. This is what the Holy Spirit said to me through that message. And the Holy Spirit may have said something entirely different than the pastor said, but what you're doing is you're putting your life on the table, and you're owning up to a relationship with the Holy Spirit where he speaks. And you're making yourself accountable to him. You're making yourself accountable to your friends. and then we pray for each other. And so very, very simple.
Okay.
And we've stepped it up for leaders, and the only way we stepped it up is the difference is instead of talking about the sermon, we're talking about a book that we've chosen.
Okay.
And we don't have a curriculum. It's just whatever book the pastor thinks the leadership team needs to read at that time. And so people are always asking me for a list of books, and I'll never give them one because I figure it ought to reflect the local pastor doing what he's doing. That's it in a nutshell. If we can get a guy to start a group, usually it starts out you attend a group, and the guy leading it sees leadership potential in you, and you become an apprentice, and then you go on from there, and eventually he leaves to start a new group, and you take it over. Well, then if you'll leave it and go start a new group and leave that one and start a new one, you do it 3 times, then we start to look at you and think, that guy could pastor a church. And so that's the heart and soul of our discipleship program. It's so simple. And it's so simple that people scoff at it. I was talking to somebody recently, one of my friends just graduated from a seminary, a well-known seminary. And out one side of their mouth, they're bragging that their professors are quoting my books. Out the other side of their mouth, they're mocking my books because they've learned so much in seminary that's so much better. The question that I have is how many churches did you plant in your lifetime?
Right.
And that always kind of cuts right to the middle of everything.
That changes the dynamic again.
Changes it entirely.
Because as I'm listening to this, I think about the beauty of it, that it's reproducible everywhere. Because one, it's based on community.
Yeah.
It's happening within the communion of saints. You're sitting together with other people who are following Jesus. You're teaching them how to listen to the Holy Spirit through the preaching of the Word. You're teaching them how to apply that, to be proactive. When God speaks, what are you going to do about it? Pray for one another. And then you are validating the fruitfulness.
Yes.
Where someone who obviously can start 2 or 3 mini churches, as you would call them, or cell groups, you're saying this man or woman has a leadership capacity that could be expanded even more.
Yeah. So we're looking for fruitfulness and faithfulness.
Okay.
If you're fruitful and not faithful, we're not interested. But you can be faithful and not fruitful. You can work really hard at serving the Lord. You can go to school. You can do everything that everybody tells you to do, and yet your life doesn't bear fruit. It's probably because you're not gifted in that particular area of ministry. And we need to find a place where you fit and you are gifted. And so not everybody's going to end up being a church planter, and we're not trying to recruit everybody.
Right.
The word almost has negative connotations. It does have negative connotations for a lot of people, but I really think of myself as an opportunist. I'm just looking for an opportunity to do stuff. I'm very disappointed on this trip. I came into Russia yesterday and love it so far, but I was supposed to overnight in Munich, and the airline changed my reservation and sent me, I was going to go LA, Munich, and then here. And they sent me San Francisco, Frankfurt, and then here. And I missed a chance to talk with a guy I'd never met. He's been to my church. He's got a Hawaiian last name, so I know he lived where I live. And he's in a place called Augsburg, Germany, and he's trying to start a Hope Chapel. And he contacted me by email. And so I had a shot at spending overnight in Munich and having dinner with the guy and just doing whatever I could to stoke the fire. And we'll work with stuff like that all the time. I got another friend in a place called Blacksburg, Virginia. And he's my friend, but he's a little more of a disciple of one of my real close friends. And I saw him a few weeks ago at a convention, and I forgot I'd seen him last summer, and we'd talked quite a bit, maybe 6 or 7 hours last summer, and I completely forgot about it. I'm getting old, and I'm a little, Alzheimer's is setting in or something. But he came to me at this convention the other day and said, I'm starting Hope Chapel, Blacksburg, Virginia. And it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. I didn't tell him that, but I did forget.
He'll find out now if he listens.
Yeah, but to me, I'll do anything I can to help him. So on the one hand, we're doing this model that works very, very well, and I'm hoping to teach him that same model, but he's not a product of that model.
Right.
And so I'm gonna look at low-hanging fruit and grab it wherever I can grab it, and do whatever we can do to just advance the kingdom of God.
That's great. That's great. Now, you've mentioned some of the early influences in your life, like Roy Hicks Jr.
Yeah.
What are some of the other influences, whether they be early influences or continued influences that have really shaped your life? Maybe, two categories. Maybe some of the people and why, and what are some of the books that have shaped you and why?
There's a book that's today called Dream Big, and it's probably used on Amazon. I don't know if you can buy it new or not. The better version of it, I actually think it's two different authors, but it's basically the same life. It's the life story of Henrierra Mears.
Okay.
And the original book was called Henrierra Mears and How She Did It. And I've seen it as a used book on Amazon. I kind of buy up every copy I can of books like that, so I can give them to people. But I read that book 7 times before I launched our church. When I started the first church, the only book I could that would come near to being a church planting book was called Move Ahead with Possibility Thinking by Robert Schuller.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a story of his starting the church in Garden Grove that became Crystal Cathedral. And I knew him. He kind of mentored me. And would rag on me because we were growing like crazy and we weren't finding real estate and we weren't building a building. And he sent people up to take me to lunch, bring me down there, and he would take me to lunch. And so he was an influence on me. Calvary Chapel and Chuck Smith were a big influence. I've listened to one tape of Chuck in my life. I heard Chuck Smith speak 2 weeks before I started the church. And at that time, he had 2,000 people coming to church in a building that would hold 350. They're having several services every weekend. They'd knocked out some walls and put in sliding glass doors, and people would sit outside in the courtyard and look in. People would sit all over the floor in the aisles, up on the platform behind him while he was preaching. And he'd just go through the Bible. He'd do 10 chapters a Sunday night. I tried it one time. I devolved to 1 chapter a Sunday night. But I decided that I wanted to do what Chuck did, but I didn't want to copy Chuck. So I resolved to never listen to him preach. And I got stuck on Ephesians 4 and just couldn't figure out what it meant. Verses 10 to 13. Jesus gave these gifts to the church, apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, to build up the saints for the work of the ministry. And that seems so simple to me today, but in those days, it just didn't fit my freshly minted theology. And so I went to the bookstore and bought a tape by Chuck, and it changed my life. I began to realize the purpose of the church is not to bless people, it's not to get people saved, the meeting, the gathering.
Right.
The purpose of the gathering is to equip the saints so they'll go out and win the world to Jesus. And once I got that and connected it up with Acts 2, and them focusing in a large group and in a small group on the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, prayer. And I started thinking, I was thinking priority order, probably wrongly, but I think that way, that the most important thing they did was the apostles' teaching. The second thing in the list is fellowship, before prayer. And so I started to think teaching and relationship got to make it happen. And so those are, Henrierra Mears, Chuck Smith, huge influences in my life. I helped a guy named Jerry Cook start a church called East Hill Church. I was 18 years old, he was 25. I was only there for 12 weeks, but very soon he was picking up the dregs of society and being mocked by the other churches. And he was bragging that the pastors in town were calling his church the garbage can church. And that one stuck on me. I decided I wanted to be the pastor of the garbage can church because Jesus came for broken people. And what I found out is that wealthy, smart, sharp people are attracted to churches that are effective with broken people.
Yeah.
And so that changed my life. As to books, I read all the time, so it's very, very hard for me to pick a single book. But that book I mentioned, New Testament Fire in the Philippines, Henrierra Mears and how she did it, those really touched my life. But there's a secular book that it's the one book I will recommend to people who are wanting a reading list. And it's by a guy named Tom Peters and Bob Waterman. It's called In Search of Excellence. Mm-hmm. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years in the early 80s. I read it between when I moved from California to Hawaii. On a trip that I had. I went to Washington State to teach, and I read it on that trip. And the first 5 chapters, or first 4 chapters, are terribly boring. I tell everybody, don't read them. It's a history of American management theory and why it failed. And then the last 8 chapters are what Peters and Waterman found were 8 characteristics that were endemic to 100 companies that had existed for over 100 years in America. Mm. And everything about those companies in the book, there's these 8 different areas of thought that every company has, but all of them relate to each other through a system of corporate vision and values. Mm-hmm. And I read that book, and it became a roadmap into the future. And I've had our leadership teams read it probably 4 times over the last 30 years. I'm about ready to do it again. Mm-hmm. I'm starting a new church. I'm 68 years old and starting a new church and having a ball. And but we're going to go through In Search of Excellence all over again, because he says things in there. One chapter title is called Ready, Fire, Aim. And the whole deal is get something started, get anything started, and so fire. You get ready, fire, and then aim it after you get it going. And we always want to analyze everything to death and strategize it to death before we'll do anything. Mm-hmm. And so we mostly do nothing.
Right.
But it's kind of, and he uses the illustration of World War II and anti-aircraft fire, where every 5th round would be a lighted round. And so at night, when the planes are coming over, they called it ACAC to fire. And the ACAC always had these tracer bullets that you could see. So you start the shooting, and then because you can see where the bullets are going, you then move the stream of bullets into the aircraft that you're trying to shoot down. So ready, fire, aim. And those kinds of lessons are just pure gold. But he's saying the 100 best companies in America mm-hmm. are ready, fire, aim companies. And so that began to mark my way of looking at the church. And so I'm a pretty simple person, and it's just taken, I read a lot. I like biographies, and I like history. I don't like church growth books. Mm-hmm. I find that they're business books in disguise. Mm-hmm. And most business books to me are just some guy that wants to sell a few books, and so he comes up with something a little quirky and puts a cool title on it, mm-hmm. and off he goes. And we do that in the Christian world. And so I'm currently going crazy reading the biographies of presidents.
Okay.
And I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm the most conservative guy in a room full of liberals, and I'm the most liberal guy in the room full of conservatives. And I like it that way, and I can't help myself. I just am that way. So I'm reading about, I've been reading about Ronald Reagan, and I've read about Nixon, and I've read about George Bush, and I've read about Harry Truman, and I'm in my 2nd U.S. Grant book, and want to read about Teddy Roosevelt after I get done with all that. And I'm finding that some of the leadership lessons that you find in the lives of these people mm-hmm. go way beyond the leadership lessons that you read in leadership books.
Right.
I read a book once called Benjamin Franklin, the First American. Mm-hmm. Phenomenal book, and marked my life. It just made me want to be a little different kind of a person. So that's where I'm at. I'm not much into the latest fad Christian book coming down the pipe. I've written a few myself, and hold them in very light esteem. Mm-hmm. If they help somebody, fine. If they don't, I could care less. Mm-hmm. I just got it in me, so I got to get it off my chest. And I found somebody that was interested in printing it, and there you go. But I don't really care if it sells a whole lot or if it cares a little. We were talking earlier. I'm hoping that after I'm dead and gone, some young kid, 18, 19 years old, is going to pulled my book off of a dusty old shelf someplace, and it'll light his fire like New Testament fire in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Got to me, and something will get started up that I had nothing to do with other than put a few thoughts on paper.
Yeah, that would be exciting. Now, how do you stay fresh yourself? I mean, everybody, would look at you and say you're 68 years old. Most people are ready to retire and go and enjoy the good life. You've earned it. You could go sit and rest on your laurels, but you're not doing that. You're as active now as I think I've ever known you to be. And how do you stay fresh spiritually? How do you do mentally, emotionally, physically?
I wish I could say I play golf, because I wish I could get a golf ball to go into the air, and I might play golf. I wish I could say I still surf, because that was my goal, is to be 70 years old and still surfing. But about 15 years ago, maybe less than that, 10 years ago, I realized because I travel so much, I don't surf enough to keep my shoulders in shape, so I can't surf. Mm-hmm. And I've been trying to do stand-up paddling, which ends up, if I'm going to stick with it, it'll be stand-up surfing, mm-hmm. Stand-up paddling and then catch a wave, which is a good thing for old men. But I'm terrified of retiring because I don't do enough stuff. I like to read. I like to write. I just this week I kind of come to realize that the kind of books I'm writing now are more books to help individual people, mm-hmm. lessons I've learned as a Christian, as a pastor. And again, I'm not selling large numbers. I'm never going to be a best-selling author. And I came to the conclusion, writing is actually kind of a hobby for me. It's something I like to do. So, I get up and I go for walks every morning. I faithfully read my Bible and pray, and quite honestly, sometimes find Bible reading very boring. Mm-hmm. I struggle with people who read the Bible every day to hear a message from God, because I don't think you're going to hear a message from God every day. I surely don't. And when I'm of that mind, and sometimes I am, it just simply depresses me on the days that God doesn't say something to mm-hmm. me, which is most days. Mm-hmm. And I find that God speaks to me the most when I'm driving my car or doing some yard work or something like that. But I try to keep the exercise going. I diligently stay in the Word. I'm in the Bible every day, no matter what. I enjoy traveling. I do a lot of travel because I train guys in how to make disciples and multiply churches. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen enough of the world. I make jokes that I know what freeways and church buildings and hotels look like everywhere in the world. Yeah. But you usually do see something. And, there's kind of wherever you go, there's the enforced day of sightseeing. They're going to take you and show you what they're proud of. And I'm glad I've seen all that. Mm-hmm. I've been places most people won't go. As a young boy, I always thought, I want to someday go to Rangoon and Kathmandu. Mm-hmm. And I thought those would be the most exotic places in the world. And I've been in both places 4 times now. And I found out that people are kind of the same everywhere in the world. The plants are a little different, mm-hmm. but the people are pretty much the same. But, I look forward now, and I think if I ever have to retire, and I know at some point I will, I still think I got 5-6 good years left in me. I hope so. But when I retire, the place I kind of wanted to see, I've been starting up my airline miles. I want to see the U.S. because it's the one place I haven't seen much of. And so and my idea of camping out is Holiday Inn Express. So I would like to rent a car and just flop around the country. And I'd like to have the freedom to not even have to make reservations in mm-hmm. advance. Just stop by the side of the road where there's a vacancy sign and see what's there.
Make your own version of Blue Highways.
Yeah.
If you remember that old book, that classic travel book. You've mentioned some of the books that you're writing now. Tell me about those.
Right now, I just wrote a book called How to Write for Amazon, or You Could Write for Amazon, mm-hmm. because I think that every pastor and leader has a book in them. I know from my experience with the publishing industry that their bread and butter is to sell 2,000 copies.
Right.
And so they assume that if you don't have an audience of about 10,000 people, they can't sell 2,000 of your books. So they're really buying your audience more mm-hmm. than they're buying your book. I mean, they're legitimate people. They want your manuscript to say something, but you need to have an audience or they're not interested. So many pastors that I know, if they do want to go write a book, will end up with a self-publishing company where they spend a whole bunch of money and now they got 2,000 books to store under their bed. And with Amazon, you put no money into it. The book is stored on a hard drive. A person orders a paperback copy of your book. It's printed that day and dumped in the mail. And the only human that has anything to do with it is the guy who puts it in the envelope that's going to get shipped in. So it's all electronic. So Amazon is interested. If they can sell 12 of your books, they're going to make some money.
Yeah.
And so if you're a pastor of 100 people and you think, well, nobody's, there's only 100 people in my church, 20 people would buy my book, you will be surprised over time. Everybody in your church will buy your book, and everybody that eventually comes through the door of your church will buy your book. And you'll probably end up selling 700 or 800 copies of your book over any given length of time at all. And so I tried to write a book that tells what Amazon does for people, simplifies the process, because I find if you can pull your thoughts together, just save them up randomly and then pull them together in a good outline. And I use a thing called Dragon Voice so I can dictate to my computer. I can whiz out, if I got a solid outline, I can make a short book in one day, the first horrible rough draft.
Right.
And then I just edit, and I don't like writing, but I do like editing. And so I'll go through a book 15 times from start to finish. And then I go through the Amazon process, and they even help you sell it. They've got all kinds of tools for that. So I've done that. The other book, I'm trying to write a book also right now on depression.
Okay.
And I've experienced depression in my life, but only in its acute form. It's short-term, temporary, some bad thing happened, I feel terrible. Or jet lag. But chronic depression, I don't understand fully. So I've been doing some research, but my whole thing is that Christians who need medications have a guilt thing going, and they feel that it's somehow ungodly to take the medications. And so I want to try to knock that in the head if I can. I wrote a book that's selling quite well, quite surprisingly well, called Defeating Anxiety. And like all my books now, it's a Kindle book and it's a paperback book, so you can buy it. And to me, the best Christian bookseller in the world is Amazon. So that book is doing quite well. But I had about 10 years ago, my wife was going through breast cancer and won the battle. And I had it was right around I guess it's longer than 10 years now. It was around the stock market crash in 2000, and we had all of our money tied up in real estate, and we'd done quite well in real estate as young people. And I went through a phase of restoring cars for people, and made enough money to buy the first property, and then I bicycled that into several others, and then we sold it all out, put it in the stock market, and went with a kind of a high name institution, and within about 6 months they lost 60% of our life savings. And so that was weighing on my head real heavy. I eventually got the money back, but I had to take it back and do it myself. And my wife's going through cancer. It was very stressful. I'm a person that really needs his sleep, and I was getting up at 4 in the morning to go with her to radiation therapy and not getting sleep, and then I went nuts. I was so the thing that pushed me over the edge was we were going to build a hot rod. We were putting a Jaguar, taking a Jaguar and putting a Chevrolet engine in it, a Corvette engine. And we built the engine, and then I got the kit to install the engine in the Jag, and it said it would take 2 guys 2 14-hour days to do this, but I could only give the thing 2 hours a week. And so my friend was going to take my car into his shop, and he's got a small shop. He was going to have to push the car outside every day to get his jobs in, and then push it back in at night, because as soon as we started to work on the car and did anything to it, the car wouldn't drive anymore. So it was going to be a hand job, and it was going to take forever. And that little thing made me crazy, and I didn't sleep for 3 nights. And finally, we decided to call him up and ask him, can I pay you to do this? And he said, yes, and that didn't help at all. I was still nuts. And kind of afraid of my own shadow. I was really out there. And my wife called the doctor and asked if I had an appointment, and he said, come in 2 days. And I started crying. And I was crying, sobbing loudly, and asked, is it okay if I go to emergency? Well, he could hear that. He said, come in right now. And so he put me on this medication that they call the aspirin of the industry. I'm not going to name it, but it's the most commonly used anti-anxiety drug that there is. And within 45 minutes, I was completely normal. It didn't feel high, didn't feel low, didn't feel anything but myself. And then I went on the internet and started reading up on it, and I found out that if you started taking it today and took it for 2 weeks in a row, you'd become addicted to it. And then I was mad at my doctor. And so I finally went and saw a shrink. And he started laughing at me, asked me, what do you think I do for a living? I said, I think you're an MD who can prescribe drugs for people with psychological problems, and you're a counselor. And he goes, wrong answer, I'm a drug dealer. And he goes, my goal that I'll never reach is to know more about these drugs than anybody on the planet. And he goes, I can tell you that your doctor gave you the right drug. And he goes, the only thing that's addictive about this drug is if you take it and then stop taking it, you're going to have an anxiety attack. And you've already had an anxiety attack, so take the drug. And so I took it for a while, and then I weaned myself off of it. And I went back to the shrink, and I took my wife with me. And because I figured she would see things maybe more clearly than I did. In other words, she'd tattle on me. And so I was so proud of myself, I got myself off the drug, and my wife pipes up and says, yeah, he's fine, except on his day off, he's crazy. He'll sit around, and the whole deal is multitasking. I could go to the driving range and fruitlessly hit golf balls, or I could go surfing in those days, or I could wash the car, or I could mow the lawn, or I could read a book. And I'd sit around all day stewing about what I could do, and I wouldn't do anything. And about 4 in the afternoon, I'd start to get depressed. And she says, he's nuts on his day off. And so the doctor just looked at me and he said, you know what, God doesn't give points for pain. Take the medicine. He goes, I promise you this, and he said what the other doctor said, this is the aspirin of this industry. It's the lowest level drug you can take. And God doesn't give points for pain, so take it. So I've been taking it ever since. And
you're still on it now?
I'm still on it, and I'm proud to be on it. I'm happy to be on it. I hope to be on it the rest of my life. And I try to encourage other people. I see too many Christians that they'll take the medicine for 3 months and then they're feeling real good. And suddenly they declare themselves healed. Tell all their friends, I'm healed, God healed me. And it was really the medicine.
Right.
And then they quit taking the medicine, and now they're ashamed to go back on the God healed me thing, and so they dropped the medicine. So I wrote this book, Defeating Anxiety. About a third of it is about why you should take the medicine.
Yeah, there's a lot of guilt that Christians feel, because if they've got something wrong with them in those areas, they feel like they're a failure. They don't have enough faith. Why isn't God pulling me through this? And so you're helping address some of those issues.
And I used to be the pastor who made those same assumptions. If you came to me and said you were on some drug for anxiety or depression, I'd get pretty straight in your face and tell you you're not in the Word enough, you're not praying enough, there's something wrong with your spiritual life, you need to get off these drugs. And then I got hit with it, and suddenly I gained compassion for all these people. And I've walked a lot of people through this. There's a lady in our church, she's a brilliant woman. She brought broadband to Hawaii, single-handedly, way back when the internet was in infant stages. And she went through an anxiety episode that just laid her low. And it was obvious to me that she just wasn't getting enough of the medication. Her doctor's prescribing her a similar medicine to the one I have. It's a kind of a cousin to it. But just not enough. And so we would talk every Sunday after church, and for about 4 months I harped on her, you're not getting enough medication, tell your doctor you need more. And she respected her doctor more than she respected me, because the doctor's a doctor. And we kind of make gods out of doctors. Finally, she went in and just said, my pastor told me that I'm supposed to ask you for more medication. The doctor was happy to give it to her. And in the very next week, she's just the same old lady I used to know, like maybe 2 years before. And she'd gone through all that suffering because she wasn't getting enough medication. And once she got enough, she's fine.
And you're finding this is being helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're finding freedom. So I think one of the things that both this and your other things that you've done, you've spoken on. I've read some of your books. We've known each other for years. What I like a lot about you, Ralph, is you give people permission to be human.
Yeah.
And it's not complex. It's not this ethereal, mystical place that only a few select people know the secret handshake to get into that club. We are human beings, broken and frail, yet somehow mysteriously connected with God. And in the midst of all of that, He picks us up, walks with us, carries us. And I love how you give people permission to be human.
I would like to say that you could arrive at a place that I read about others saying. I've come to a point where I'm kind of a God-fearing, born-again, Holy Spirit baptized cynic. And I read a lot of Christian stuff, and I think it's a lot of baloney, to be honest. I read some of it, I think it's very real. You know, I look at guys like Brother Lawrence, you know, centuries ago, and I see stuff that I think is really very real. A lot of what I read, I think, is really good marketing. And I think we need permission to just be ourselves. You know, there's a guy in my church that, you know, I'll have a beer once in a while. I enjoy a glass of wine, and I think I actually have the capacity to become an alcoholic if I wasn't careful of myself. But there's a guy in my church that, one of the best Christians I know. He's generous. He's always helping people. He's giving away money to people. Getting behind causes in the secular world, shares his faith with people. I know he swears, you know, and he doesn't know that I know that he swears, but I know he swears, and that just tells me he's human. And I'm to me he's one of the most faithful, godly men that I know. But one day I walked into a restaurant in Honolulu, and he was sitting there with a beer on the table. And he just freaked out. He was trying to hide the beer from me. And it's like, and so I just went over and said, drink your beer. You know, get real. And I mean, we're human. This whole thing about me talking about medicines, and I don't think a person is any less Christian for having a headache and taking an aspirin and ibuprofen.
Right.
So they shouldn't be any less Christian for having an anxiety attack and taking a pill that the doctor gives them. If you know, I'm going to get well any way I can.
Well, I think you hit on something here that is one of the most painful aspects that we as believers have to live with, and it's this belief that Christians impose on us that if you were really walking with God, then you wouldn't have this problem or that problem. You know, we all remember the recent tragedy that happened to a very prominent pastor there in Southern California, where his son committed suicide. And that was a terrible tragedy. And there are no words to comfort for that. And, you know, to hear and to see some of the Christian community's response to that was shameful. That what we should have been offering were our tears, not our judgments. And so to be able to hear you talk about this in such a way that, you know, somebody listening to this, they could be at the top of their game in spiritual leadership, and yet they feel this is something they have to be ashamed of.
Right.
They need to go and hide this. Right. And, you know, if we can just help them bring it out of the closet and say, you know what, it's okay to be broken. It's okay to be a human being. That God has taken from us a heart of stone, and He's given us a heart of flesh. Right. And He's made us in this fearful and wonderful way. I think anything that we can do to help people do that is going to be outstanding. And, you know, your writing has done that. Your life has done that. I want to ask you one more question. I know we're going to be running out of time here pretty quick. But I want you to imagine that you have a chance now that at 68 to go back in time and have a conversation with your 25-year-old self. What advice would you give a 25-year-old Ralph Moore now?
I would give a 25-year-old Ralph Moore this advice, that the key to success is perseverance. And by success, I don't mean vast numbers. I mean, we started a lot of churches. Some of them actually are mega churches. A couple churches that I pastored have gone to a couple thousand, but we have one right now that's at about 7,000. But I'm not shooting for that at all. I just want to see people keep putting one foot in front of the other and going in the direction God's taking you. I call that success.
Amen.
Because you can be in an inner city neighborhood where real estate dictates the size of the church. And you may have only 40 people because there's no place for you to meet.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, this whole idea of megachurch basically occurs, I mean, going all the way back, let's look at Crystal Cathedral.
Right.
Crystal Cathedral was built where it was built, in a place where the suburbs met the cows.
Yeah.
And now it's smack in the middle of Orange County. But in those days, it was vacant land everywhere, and you could buy land dirt cheap. And so a church could get big enough in the city or in the suburbs to afford to go to the fringes of the suburbs where the rural area started, buy rural land, build a big building. And now for Schuler, that was like 20 acres. Mm-hmm. I think Chuck Smith got nearly 20 acres, 18 acres or something like that. Again, it was cow pastures down.
Right.
But now we're talking about churches with campuses of 100 and 120 acres. I heard Francis Chan recently say, do you believe that that's even possible with the direction that the United States economy is going? Mm-hmm. That model just is unsustainable. But it's always been unsustainable. It only works where the suburbs meet the country. Mm-hmm. It never works in the countryside because of lack of population.
Right.
And it doesn't work in urban areas where real estate is very expensive. I spend a lot of time in Tokyo. And there is a church now of 1,500 in Tokyo because they found a company that owns several large auditoriums and will rent to them. But there's only that one company, and they own like 7 auditoriums. So we could have 7 mega churches in Tokyo, and everybody else is going to be confined to very small numbers.
Right.
And feel bad about themselves.
Right.
And so I just came from Tokyo, and I was called on to do a thing called The Power of the Small Church. And when I started really thinking about it and analyzing it, there's a lot to be said for smaller churches. Mm-hmm. For one, they're highly relational.
Yeah.
Evangelism has to be relational evangelism rather than program evangelism. They're very supportive of each other. Everybody knows each other. If something's wrong in your life, somebody knows you're missing. So there's a lot to be said for that. But again, back to your question, if God called you to pastor a megachurch, then put one foot in front of the other and pastor the megachurch and do it with all your heart. But if he called you to be bivocational and pastor 30, 40 people or 200, 300 people, do that with all your heart. Just keep going.
Yeah.
That's the advice.
That's great. That's great. Well, Ralph, if somebody wanted to connect with you, maybe find out more about your resources, is there a website or a way that they can contact you, connect with your resources?
I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
So just befriend me. I have another Facebook page called it's Facebook/RalphMooreHawaii.com.
Okay.
And then I have a website called www.ralphmoorehawaii.com, and I can be contacted those
Okay,
ways.
great. We'll include those in the show notes for
That's
anybody who
good.
wants to contact you and just be able to get a hold of your resources. I believe you've got some books, some videos that
we were doing the videos, but I got to where I just didn't want to be involved with the marketing end of it.
Okay.
And so the other place to find me is just type my name in on Amazon, and everything will pop up that I've got out there.
Okay.
And I'm pretty much, I may even do some audio stuff with Amazon. But again, I want them to host it, I want them to inventory it, I want them to market it. I want to be free to just do what I do,
Right.
and not have to mess with all that stuff.
Wonderful.
So-
Well, Ralph, it's been a joy to have you here, and I sure appreciate you taking
Well,
time
thank
to
you.
be with us.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, we're done now. Thanks for listening. This is Jeff Roper reminding you that the mission of God is too grand for mediocrity or average living. You were created for a purpose, and that purpose is found in the mission of God. It's your life. Now go live it.